Did you actually leave that in the live one?
Yeah, I clipped it, and that's the intro on both of them. Is just his hand holding the sticker.
Welcome to That's a Reach podcast, where we sit down to talk through questions about the Bible, theology, the gospel, and more, and how they influence your everyday life. You may have had these questions yourself, so we hope you find this conversation encouraging and clarifying in your pursuit of Jesus.
Hey everybody, welcome to That's a Reach podcast. My name is Taylor, not to be confused with Taylor number 1, Taylor number 2. We've got a few questions for you today, and so we're going to start with the first one. How do I deal with feelings of rejection in a godly way?
I'm going to assume, based on our context, that is probably a dating question, but I also think that you can, on a general whole, you need to learn how to deal with those types of things, because there's stuff in life where we're going to get rejected, like trying to apply for jobs or, trying to grow in friendship. And there's even something that we have to deal with within our evergreen culture, where we have a lot of discipleship that we have going on. Sometimes a discipleship relationship doesn't work out, and that's okay. Not everyone has to be BFF forever in this life. And so just learning to deal with rejection in general is an important thing. And I'd say my first bit of advice is learning an eternal perspective on things, because with our short-sighted human mindset, we think about stuff in such a short, narrow way, but God sees such a much larger picture. And that's a lot of I was having a conversation with someone the other day even about money, and that's one of the things that Jesus tells us about in the Sermon on the Mount, is talking about having an eternal perspective when it comes to our time and our resources. But I even say the same thing with our relationships and our feelings and stuff. Having an eternal perspective and shifting your mindset on those things is one of the ways to, in a godly way, deal with rejection and not be kind of stuck. We feel stuck in our feelings in the moment. We feel stuck in our short-sightedness as being, finite humans. But God allows us through the Holy Spirit, through reading of the Scriptures, to gain a eternal perspective. And I think that'd be my first bit of advice on a broad scale of how to deal with rejection.
Yeah, I think there's also a value question here, because part of rejection is like it takes like a huge shot at your value, like and what you think makes you valuable. That's part of why breakups are hard, right? It's not just like you lose this person that you were close to, but also it's like you're not worth keeping, or like, or even just your identity's under threat. Like you were that person's boyfriend or girlfriend, and now what are you, right? And so I think that there's, a valuable prayer is God, show me what makes me valuable, right? Because you get to a place where you realize that the things that make you valuable are not the things about you, not almost like the things that can be taken away, if you will. The reason that you have value is because you're created in God's image, and you are and you're a walking, talking billboard for Jesus Christ, right? And so those things give you value, and that's That's your ability to worship God.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's you start attaching your identity and your value to your job, your career, your degree path, your significant other, and then when those things don't work out, your value gets stolen. And so I think I think you're right. There's like this general version of this, which is like look, having that perspective from that heavenly realm, from that eternal perspective, but also then taking that to the specific place, because it's kind of like saying, like, what's your value? Well, to glorify God. And it's like, great, but what is like Matt O'Mealy's specific contribution to that? Well, ask God what makes you valuable, what he sees in you specifically. And this goes back to like every issue we ever have, which is the wrong answer is to not take that directly into God's presence. It's the only way you lose, because no matter what you're dealing with, even if you're making, like, you're blaming God for what you're dealing with, fine, go tell him that. Go sit in his presence and say to God, I blame you, and let him work that out in you, And the reason we don't do that is because we don't actually want it worked out. We want to sit in that feeling. We want to sit in that place. And so I think that there's something to be said for you're dealing with rejection. Okay, fine. Go take that to God and ask him to fix it.
Yeah.
Sit with him on it. So I don't know. That would be the direction I would
think
go.
that also applies to the finding an eternal perspective, because from God's perspective, how does he view you?
Right.
Does he think you're not worthy of
Yeah,
love?
right.
Does he think you're not worthy of his time to be a friend or whatever? Does he not have a specific job or path for you?
And if you
does.
start finding that security in the way God sees you and seeing yourself from that eternal perspective, seeing your value in the things that are eternal and in the way God sees you, the hits from the external things, not that they don't hurt, but they're significantly easier to deal with.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. It doesn't remove the pain of rejection that we deal with in this life, but it doesn't rock us and send us into a spiral like it can when we don't have that eternal perspective and we forget who God says we are.
Right.
In that same way.
And I think the rejection can be applied to dating like we've talked about, but also rejection in anything in our lives. And it's like the perspective of, are we walking in God's will? Are we walking in what he has for us? Because if we are, then the feelings of rejection aren't going to be it. You're going to see it and view it as a learning moment, not just woe is me in a way. So
yeah. And I think in that regard too, changing your perspective and understanding the value that God places on you will also lessen the amount of time that you are struggling with it as well. I hope that's helpful. Without knowing all the specifics of the context, I think just in general, those are the areas that I would point people towards.
Yeah. Okay, we'll jump into question number 2. Please explain spiritual warfare. I'm so confused.
I love the two pleases.
The double
please explain this to me.
crying emoji.
Yeah.
I would say, without getting into the weeds, and so much of it is speculative. The reason that it stays a question and it stays the way it is because in a lot of instances, the Bible is not specific on it. There's a lot of things, just I think in general, on the overly spiritual, supernatural realm that the Bible's not super specific on. Because how helpful and productive would that be for us as created beings to be, paralyzed with confusion and fear of a supernatural realm? But the Bible does show that it does exist. Old Testament and New Testament, spiritual warfare exists. Demons, angels, it is clear that is a thing. But I also don't think it is a thing because the Bible doesn't overly emphasize it. I don't think it's a thing that we need to be overly emphasizing as well. There's different streams of Christian orthodoxy and denominations and stuff that will overly ignore it or overly focus on it.
Right.
And the healthier thing is to acknowledge that it exists and not be scared of it, but also not allow ourselves to go down a road of unhealthy fascination or unhealthy fear about it. So what is spiritual warfare? There's a lot that can be said. I think we even talked about some of the ideas of where demons and stuff come from when we talked about Enoch and other extra biblical books, several episodes ago. But what is our enemy? It's the world, the flesh, and the devil is what we battle against. And the enemy, through the demons, through the fallen angels, whatever you want to call them, he is working to manipulate the world and the flesh against us. So our fleshly desires, our weaknesses to trip us up, or manipulating the lost, non-believing world to make the world in general suffer. Just to point out some resources, I think we did the same thing before, but the Bible Project has good deep dives into different aspects about what are the spiritual beings, what is the heavenly council, all those types of questions. They do some good deep dives on that kind of help to, for me, it was all these big questions about what is that. I was like, okay, I see what's going on there now when I read these things. It's connecting some dots. But what the enemy in the supernatural realm is doing is manipulating. We see that through the Old Testament, is manipulating the powers of government for the destruction of humanity. It's manipulating the relationships around where God is trying to work, trying to use those relationships to pull people down, to distract them. That's what a lot of the reason that God didn't want there's many reasons that God didn't want the Israelites to go after idols and stuff, but that is one of the things that was a spiritual, supernatural, demonic distraction for them. And so what is spiritual warfare? We don't believe that a Christ follower, a true disciple, can be possessed
right.
internally and controlled, but we do believe that they can be oppressed when doors are open, when there is bad habits, when there is bad relationships, where there is wrong ways of thinking. That's what the enemy uses to manipulate and to drag that person down. If you haven't read C.S. Lewis's fiction book of the Screwtape Letters, it's a good example of the idea of what it looks like for the enemy through the flesh and through the world around them and through relationships to try and drag a person down and to keep them from coming to faith. So that, as it is a fiction book, but it is a good example of what it looks like when a person is being manipulated by the enemy.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think. So I have two things on this. One is it's important to remember that there tend to be kind of two tactics in this. There's surprise and intimidation,
Mm-hmm.
and so in our culture, what we see a lot more of is surprise, because the enemy has a massive benefit in our culture because we're so smart and we're so scientific that
so smart
demons can't possibly exist,
Yeah.
right? And so what he does is he lets us live in that world where he doesn't confront us a lot in those open ways, and allows him to kind of always be meddling in our lives with us pretending he's not there, right?
Yeah.
You can't fight an enemy you don't think exists.
Yeah.
And then if you go, you hear stories from the mission fields of missionaries confronting very blatant examples of demons and spiritual warfare. Why? Because in those cultures where if you're living in a remote part of the world with a witch doctor, it's like they believe in demons, they believe in spiritual warfare. So the enemy in those settings is working through intimidation, and it's more oppressive and overpowering.
Yeah. When it comes to things like that, like witch doctors, modern witchcraft, whatever you want to think of, people are like, oh, look, a thing happened, therefore it must be real.
Sure.
You can even look at the example of Moses going against, Pharaoh's sorcerers in the book of Exodus.
Yeah, they were faking stuff.
Yeah, they were faking stuff, but how did that happen? Like, there's some instances where it was probably just demonic influence,
Sure.
where they have some flexibility where they are manipulating
Right.
the world
Right.
in order to trick people, because they want at all ways possible, they're trying to keep our eyes off of the
Right.
one true God
Right.
and the way that things actually are. And so they're trying to distract, they're trying to intimidate, they're
Yeah.
trying to confuse.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into, there's a practical application side of this. And one of the things that I'm always telling people, like, whatever end of the extremes that you're on, you probably need to go back towards center, right? And so there's this level at which people, first of all, we don't know how many angels and demons there are. We're told great multitudes, and that, roughly a third of them became fallen, right? So we don't know what those numbers are. Is it possible that everywhere you go in your entire life, there's angels and demons, like, right around you, fighting it out, having these spiritual... Yeah, it's possible. It's also possible that you live most of your life without encountering angels and demons, right? Like, I don't think that I'm not saying it's wrong to think this, but I don't really think that there's, we have like this one guardian angel following us around, or we have this one demon that's trying to fight in our life.
Yeah.
And so there's this balance, because you have people on one end who are like, that stuff's not real. Well, the practical application there is, because you don't recognize that it is real, you are suspect to being ambushed by it. But then there's this other side where every single thing that happens in your life is somehow the demon's fault. The demon that's following me around is causing this bad thing to happen. Or I only sinned because that demon was right there tempting me. It's like, okay, let's stop for a second. First of all, James says that part of the reason you sin is because you have evil desires internally, right? And you got to think about it like this. The enemy doesn't have to be present in every situation. Think about in warfare, leaving a minefield somewhere. You don't have to watch a minefield. You can lay it out and then wait for the enemy to walk into it and trip up, and you don't have to be there for it. Well, the enemy is laying mines all over the place.
Yeah.
There's mines everywhere. I mean, every time you open up your computer, there's a minefield. Every time you go out in public, there's a minefield. And so, to a certain extent, could there be a very active presence in your life? Yeah, absolutely. Also, don't blame everything on that demon. You're responsible for, sometimes spiritual warfare is just your spirit warring against your flesh.
Yeah.
That's the spiritual
Bible
warfare.
also points that out
Yes.
excessively.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing is, like, I would say if you're on the end where everything in your life you attribute to the nearest angel and demon, maybe you need to take a good hard look in the mirror, you know?
Yeah.
And if you're on the other end where you don't think that angels and demons that's just a fairy tale, well, then you need to look at the Bible and see that it testifies that this is a reality, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's not something to be scared of. It's not something to be obsessed about. And that doesn't, we're not saying that we have all the answers and that we have it right, but you know, I've seen some things. I know people personally that have dealt with some things both in America and on the mission field. You know, I believe it's very real.
Yeah.
But like Taylor said, I don't think it's like this. There's not this constant thing where the enemy, and some people will try and over spiritualize it and like, well, if you're not being spiritually attacked, I guess you're not a real threat to the devil.
Right.
It's like, no, don't beat yourself up to where I got to go start, you know, being some crazy street preacher so the devil will attack me. Like, no, don't. This is not, you know, just with spiritual warfare, with so many other things in life, it's not some, you know, mystical algebra equation that we're trying to figure out to solve this, to battle the enemy. Don't think that way either. That's not helpful. But spiritual warfare is very real. The enemy does not want us to be what I say that, you know, what I see in Scripture. Peter says this, that as we grow in maturity, we are effective and productive, and the enemy does not want us to be effective and productive. So if he can confuse us, if he can scare us, if he can even just allow us to remain in ignorance, thinking, he's not going to do anything, there's no real danger to that, then we're still going to be ineffective and unproductive. We are in a battle. The Scriptures tell us to be ready for battle, and our enemy is not flesh and blood. It is the principalities and powers of the air. That is what we battle against. So it is a very real thing, but it's not something to be scared of, because we fight from a position of winning, a position of success and victory. We've talked about this a lot, I think even within Reach, and I know Michael has mentioned this before in recent Sunday sermons. Jesus says that the gates of hell will not prevail over those that know him, those that are following after him. The gates of hell, that means that they're on the defense. Yeah. They're backpedaling. And so we don't need to be in a position of fear. So as we please explain spiritual warfare, the main thing is it is real, but we don't need to be scared, because as a Christ follower, you fight from a position of victory, and God has the ultimate victory in the end. Right. So anything to add, Taylor, too?
No, that's good.
Cool,
that's
man.
Good. Okay. Last question. Should we seek global Christian hegemony, culturally and or politically, or should we persevere in person-to-person influence while recognizing that the world will get more and more rotten with sin?
Yeah. So
it's an eschatology question.
Sure, and there is a level of which this is almost like a false choice, right? There's like So to answer the question, like in the most simplified format, like no, we absolutely should not pursue a Christian hegemony, right?
Yeah.
That's totally missing the point, right? And I think that everywhere you see that in human history, like literally every culture that has ever been predominantly Christian, you just end up with this completely opposite-ended problem, which is tons of people think they're Christians and they're not, right?
Yeah.
So it's no better. Like it's like it may be easier, and it is, and that's what leads to the apathy that is people not sharing the gospel and people not hearing the gospel, because everybody's a Christian. Look around, like it's all Christianity. Like what that's called Christendom. Right? That is absolutely not what we're supposed to pursue, right? Okay, but the reason I say it's like in a sense a false choice is because yes, you absolutely should be pursuing person-to-person interactions and the spread of the gospel. Or even like, you know, I mean, you could say like preaching is not a person-to-person interaction, right? But that's still spreading the gospel. But here's the reason I say like it's not quite that simple. There's an implication. Now, I'm not accusing whoever asked that question of this necessarily. There is almost an implication in this conversation that, well, if Christians would focus on the gospel, then they shouldn't worry about anything else. Okay, but here's the thing. God cares about the physical world we live in.
Yeah.
So even though the highest pursuit is the gospel, there is a level at which we are called, like, honestly, how effective is the gospel if we tell everybody, like, we don't care about your physical well-being or needs at all? It's why we bring food to starving people and share the gospel. It's why we should participate in politics. It's why Christians should join militaries in times of conflict. And now there's obviously so many implications of that. Like if I you want to point it like Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, well now we need to have a debate. We need to have a debate about existential crisis versus a war that maybe we shouldn't be in the first place. There's so many elements there, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, do I think Christians should have joined the army when Hitler was literally taking over the world? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I absolutely think Christians should have been a part of that, right? And so I think when you talk about things like this, there's a level at which should we, vote for, for instance, against things like abortion? Yeah, absolutely, because there's souls at stake. There is, what about the gospel to all of those unborn children, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a level at which, no, we should not pursue a Christian hegemony, for sure. But that also does not imply that we abdicate pursuing goodness in the world for the sake of the gospel, right? And it comes down to this: what's your hope in? Is your hope in the gospel? Then even in your voting, in your view of world events, how does that further the gospel? And at the same time, why would I say no to a Christian hegemony, even though that would make things so much easier for Christians? Because my hope isn't in some political order or Christian culture.
Yeah.
My hope is in the gospel being spread, but I'm going to spread the gospel alongside of meeting needs in a physical way.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the reason I said I think it's kind of an eschatology problem too, because some people think, well, it used to be popular. It's post-millennial, right, where they thought that the world would get better and better because Christians would win and win and win.
Right,
and then World War I and World War II happened, and then it became less popular.
Yeah.
But it's becoming popular thought again. It's a more recent thing where it's coming back up again.
We need a World War III.
Exactly. Yeah, you got to just keep people in their place, right? No, that'd be terrible. But it's the idea. I think it also brings up the question, and this is going to, probably open up more cans of worms that we don't need to do today, but then it's the question of the problem of evil, because I think the answer to the problem of evil is going back to what we were talking about earlier, even with talking about rejection and the spiritual warfare, that humanity is, no one is righteous, no, not one. Like we are broken, and there is no end to the gratuitous amounts of evil and violence that we can come up with on our own.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that even a culture that is having a spiritual revival is going to overcome the brokenness that is in the world, because I don't think that's the plan. It's not we're supposed to get everything, as good as we can get it, kind of a B+ before God comes back, and he'll kind of like push us over the edge of goodness.
Right.
Like there's going to be lots of, because like where's the church growing right now? Where it's oppressed in China and in the Middle East, it's booming in underground churches, because we don't need an easy time. We don't need a comfortable time in order for Christianity to spread.
Right.
And so a global Christian hegemony is not going to make Christianity easier. It makes us apathetic. In our context, growing up in the Bible Belt, we, it's starting to, in my generation, older than a lot of our young adults, I'm a middle millennial, everyone knew all the Bible answers because everyone's grandma forced them to go to VBS.
Right.
And so it was really hard to evangelize people that are my age. I'm 39, because everyone knows the basic Bible answers. They prayed their prayer 10 times in a row at VBS, and they're still, not followers. They're still, living for themselves.
Yeah, I have friends that grew out of it.
Yeah, exactly. They grew out of it. Yeah, those types of things. And I'm hearing that less and less with the younger 20-somethings that we deal with, because I think our culture has grown out of
post-Christian.
Being, we're becoming post-Christian in that regard. So the bubble of the Bible Belt has been popping a little bit in that regard, and some people are freaking out about it. I mean, is that sad because there's more obvious outward sin happening? Sure, I guess, but it makes it more clear. There's a clear delineation between salvation and not.
I remember in like my early high school, middle school time frame, thinking, how do you live like a Christian in a way that doesn't look like the world? Because everybody kind of lived like a Christian to my immature eyes, right?
Yeah.
But now it's like, I can give you 10 things right off the top of my head that my non-Christian friends will go do every week that I'm not going to go do because that's not who I'm called to be,
Yeah.
And that's and what is that? That's not a moral superiority. Like, oh, look at me. That is just saying like, hey, there's a clear dividing line.
Yeah.
The question becomes, why do you act like that? Well, because Jesus saved me, and
Yeah.
I'm going to live according to that reality.
Yeah.
You know.
Why don't you go drink and party all the time?
Yeah.
Well, because I'm not trying to fill an empty void in my
Yeah.
life. I
Right.
don't need that feeling. I don't need to escape, because the reality I'm in, knowing that I'm a son of the Father and that I have my Christian brothers and sisters with me, I don't need to escape that reality.
Yeah.
No matter how difficult the world is around me, I don't need to go
Yeah.
party.
Yeah, and to be clear, kind of the implication, it's almost more confusing when you look at it from like a political angle, like how involved in
Yeah.
politics should Christians be? And again, my question is, where's your hope, right?
Mhm.
Like you participate, but you don't put your hope in. But like an easier example of this is, ask yourself why almost every hospital in the world has a Christian foundation.
Yeah.
Because Christians went and built hospitals all over the place to help people and care for people. Well, those were believers who put their hope in the gospel and also said we need to care and love for people
Yeah.
and like, have a love for people that manifests in actually treating disease and fixing, malady, like actually helping them,
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's like, if your hope is in the gospel, that should drive you to meet some physical needs.
And it's not just the Mother Teresa's of the world that
Right.
are doing that.
No,
it's,
right.
It's the normal Christians. And even though a lot of the hospitals that are named, Mercy, whatever, and Baptist Hospital, this, a lot of them have been kind of like sold off and now they're corporate and all
They're, like,
that.
co-opted.
They have been. But when you look even at the statistics in America and globally, it's still Christians are the ones that give the majority towards charity.
Yeah, right.
And it's not saying that lost people don't give generously. They do.
Yeah.
Like giving generously it's not like the marker of being a Christ follower,
Yeah.
but
And actually, this question, like, this is why some of those hospitals got sold off, is because there was during the conservative resurgence, when the Baptists, like, basically gave up a bunch of their schools and seminaries and hospitals, was because they were like, we're gonna take the gospel to every nation. It's like, hey, as a matter of fact, hospitals were a great way of taking the gospel places.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
a really good method, you know.
And we've also talked about this before, but it was probably a misstep on their part
It was.
to do that.
It was.
Because humans like to pendulum swing.
Yes.
Oh, we got this thing wrong. It must be the exact
The
opposite.
whole opposite direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was the thing, is like that was a misstep because it was short-sighted.
Yeah.
And part of it, again, we're told to live in the last days. What that means is live in a way that says Jesus could come back at any moment. What that doesn't mean is, because Jesus is gonna, like, it's like that. What's that scene in Parks and Rec with the guys who think that aliens gonna show up, and so they're like spending their money and that's it. The Christians got to this
I'll
place,
sell it to you.
right? And Christians got to that place where they were like, oh, Jesus is gonna come back any day now, so we can sell off all our hospitals and sell off all our seminaries. And it's like, hold on, like, but if Jesus doesn't happen to come back tomorrow, we're still gonna need those things to share the gospel, And so it's like, yes, focus on sharing the gospel, but understand that there are methods that increase the reach of the gospel.
Yeah. One recent example that I can point to that we're part of, the Southern Baptist Convention, our church is, and the SBC in America has a DR, disaster relief.
Yep.
And, in Oklahoma, we have lots of tornadoes. We see those guys come out whenever there's a tornado. They're usually wearing yellow shirts that say like what, churches they're from and all that. When I lived in New Orleans, I moved there in 2008, so 3 years after Katrina, and I had heard about it as I was coming into the city, and I continued to hear and see it, but people would talk about, non-believers would talk about the fact that down in New Orleans, it's like the Catholic, like, archdiocese and the government, they're like, hey, you're supposed to fix all of our problems. Katrina happens, and both of them dropped the ball constantly. But those Baptists in the yellow shirts, they would come in and they would fix everything in somebody's house for free and take care of them and ask for nothing.
Yeah.
And so they were like, so there was this article that was like the seminary would point it out when they were recruiting people to go to seminary down there. They're like, hey, the gospel, we have an inroad right now because Katrina, it softened people's hearts. It was an atheist columnist in New Orleans wrote, hey, apparently the Catholic Church and the government can't fix it, so someone needs to call the Baptists to come and fix some problems. And so that's an example of bringing the gospel by helping meet people's actual physical needs,
Right.
and then loving them as their neighbor and looking for opportunities to share
Right,
Christ with them.
right.
That's what the hospitals were doing for generations, and we continue in that philosophy when we come up with those types of solutions.
Right.
and allow the Lord to use us to bless people
Right,
in
right.
that way,
And that
physically.
and that can even extend to political activism to an extent, right?
Yes, yeah.
It's like don't think, well, I only care about the gospel, so I'm going to recede from having
Yeah.
any interaction with the rest of the world in a way that might impact somebody's life, you know.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, we the Bible clearly, Old Testament and New Testament, tells us to seek the good of our neighbors.
yeah, right.
Whether that was the Israelites in exile or whether that was Paul telling people to be a good neighbor,
Yeah.
Jesus telling us to be a
Yeah.
good neighbor, like seeking
Well,
the good of our neighbor is who we are.
And you see like the Israelites in exile, for instance, is a great example. Like they were supposed to build up the cities that they were in exile in. They were supposed to pray for them and hope for their best.
not just for the Israelites' benefit,
Yes.
but for everyone's
and not just be
benefit.
like, these are our captors, I hope they die and
Yeah.
we get to go home. It's like that. No, that's not how we're called to live, you know.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Anything from
That's
you,
good.
T2?
I think these answers are going to help a lot of people.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
But hey, thanks for joining us on this episode of That's Reach podcast. Please keep submitting questions so we can have more podcasts and answer more questions. So awesome.
another one done.
Peace.
Well, hot dog.
Thanks for joining us on That's a Reach. We are pastors and leaders from the Reach Young Adult Ministry at Evergreen Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and these questions come from those in our young adult community here. If you're from a different church and context, we hope you found the discussion beneficial and edifying as you pursue spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ in your culture and context.